you did make the point that this would be a sea change in thinking if Crimea did exit the fold of Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin has made... he's been very vocal in his defence of sovereignty over the last 15 years as president and prime minister, the importance of sovereignty. He's a statist. He believes in the integrity of a state. Are we seeing a change in his thinking?
Well, it's hard to say, because his interview the other day he said pretty much in terms, I think, that he does not want to change borders. And that's a pretty big deal. And I don't want to argue too much with the previous speaker. I wouldn't interpret the ICJ judgment on Kosovo in quite the way he does. But be all this as it may, where I think what you do as a diplomat is you build upon what you've got in common. And the first thing President Putin said in his press conference the other day was that Ukrainians are fed up with thieves of different shapes and sizes running Ukraine. Now, that seems like a pretty sort of important proposition. I would have thought that we must be pretty fed up with the thieves running Ukraine. The basic deal is, how do we in Europe and Russia find legitimate Ukrainian partners to clean up everyone's act? And that seems to me the best place to start. And I'm as hawkish as the next person on communism and ex-communism and goodness knows what. But I personally feel uncomfortable with this sort of idea of putting sanctions on Russia. It's a UN Security Council permanent member. This is just not going to work. Russia will just laugh at this. And anything we do to them, they will do worse to us.
Vera, what's the plight of people in Ukraine that you know, and what are they telling you? I mean, how are they feeling about matters at the moment? I mean, clearly there's an economic crisis, there's a political crisis. What are they saying?
Well, it's a country we just have gone through really traumatic times. So I think people are quite traumatized. So even people who feel that their narrative, so to speak, has won, which is Euromaidan, and I call it narrative because I felt there was an information war as much there was a seizure of power by force. Euromaidan have had quite a sophisticated PR campaign, which seemed to have been quite remarkably prepared right from the beginning of the demonstrations. And they have been really pushing this narrative and shaming publicly people who do not support it on their media. So I think I find it very difficult to speak with people in Ukraine. Some of my friends are frightened to discuss matters on Facebook and have asked me to try and speak to them in person. I get a sense that people are truly frightened to speak up their mind.
And so you have no faith in the ability of the interim government to kind of bring to heel those extremist elements, and there are extremist elements in a minority in the government, and who spearheaded the Maidan revolution.
I have a feeling that these pro-Russian forces in the eastern part of Ukraine, specifically in Donetsk and Odessa and Kharkov, they will be becoming stronger if people will be persecuted. There will be similar mirror situation that has happened in Kiev. As soon as the President Yanukovych has been pushing the protesters down, people stand up. So I feel that it will be very difficult for them to reconcile it. And they're not trying to make any steps towards these people. Quite the opposite. They today have been encouraging everybody to only speak Ukrainian, to show that we're all Ukrainian, we're all one united Ukraine. So how do Russian people who don't speak Ukrainian feel about it, even if they are pro-united Ukraine?
And Dmitry Babich, that has alienated a good proportion of the Russian-speaking population. Russian is no longer an official language in Ukraine.
Well, it has not been an official language since 1991, which is a travesty because Ukraine is by its destiny a bilingual country. But unfortunately, I think this whole affair is a massive favor of the EU and the West in general. And I'm not just speaking about the support that the EU and the United States gave to Ukrainian staying the only state language and not even making Russian official language, as three presidents promised. Kuchma promised that, Yanukovych promised that, and even Kravchuk promised that, and they never fulfilled their promises. But let's remember, how it all started. It all started from a relatively minor controversy. Yanukovych asked to postpone signing the association agreement with the EU. He didn't cancel it. He was actually pro-European. It was clear that he wanted more to go to the European Union than to the customs union with Russia. And the EU was so intransigent that little by little the situation got into a deadlock where we are now. And now I think very soon everyone will forget about this godforsaken association agreement which started the whole thing.
Although, Dmitry, to be fair, sorry for interrupting though, Dmitry, most people would accept that he had considerable shortcomings as president. He could have explained better the association agreement. He could have taken it to the people. He could have said, this will throw millions of people out of work. This is not good for our economy. He never did that. I'll tell you, he explained it several times, but Euromaidan already started, and as Vera said, it had a very good PR campaign. So anyone saying that was immediately portrayed in the Ukrainian media as a traitor, as stooge of Moscow. You know, I understand Ukrainian like most Russians, so I followed that campaign very closely. But unfortunately, what I want to say is, speaking about the West's carrots and sticks, unfortunately, this intransigent policy continues, because if you look at the list of people who will have their assets frozen in the West, if they have any, who will have their visas cancelled, they include Nikolai Azarov, the former prime minister, who obviously had nothing to do with violence, and he obviously wanted to sign that agreement. It was clear from a lot of his statements. For some reason, this list includes the education minister Dmitry Babich. He was hated by the Ukrainian nationalists because he wanted Tolstoy and Pushkin to be taught at Ukrainian schools again. Before, they haven't been even taught at Ukrainian schools because they were considered to be foreign writers. Although, Tolstoy and Gogol, for example, who was born in Ukraine, they are not quite, they wrote in Russian, but they are not alien to Ukraine. Okay.
Basically, why include these people in this list? The problem is that this list shows that the same intransigent policy continues.
And what about NATO, though? I mean, Liam Halligan, it's not just about the EU. Putin has for years said that he doesn't like the encroachment of NATO on Russian borders. He sees this as a potential way of making sure that doesn't happen. No one's really talking about NATO, though, are they?
They're not, because in the end, there's never been a single opinion poll in Ukraine in favour of NATO membership. That's just the reality. Ukraine doesn't want to be part of NATO, however much Western capitals may fantasise that it does. The big mistake the EU made, and it almost made it seems deliberately, is that it tried to force Ukraine to choose between Western Europe and Russia. That's not what Ukraine is. Ukraine's destiny isn't only to be a bilingual nation, as we just heard from Dmitry. It's also to be the bridge between the West European and the Slavic world. That's what it is, and it can do that job extremely well, if only it was allowed to do so. Another thing I wanted to mention is that, of course, Yanukovych was by no means a perfect president in any way, and a lot of his behaviour has been, at best thuggish, at worst criminal. But the reality is he was elected in 2010, and the OSCE, which of course is backed by all the Western powers, in its monitoring report of that election, it called it fair, balanced, and a good example of democracy. Certainly a big step forward from the previous presidential election. So if the Ukrainian people as a whole wanted to get rid of their president, and they probably would have got rid of their president in 2015, the election was just around the corner, then that would have happened. That has to be for them to decide. And when we go around as Western Europeans or as Americans trying to impose our will, and particularly when we say incredibly crass things like the US Secretary of State, forgive me, it's not right to invade countries with no pretext, we just make ourselves look ridiculous, frankly.
And on that United States point of view, Francis Boyle, I suppose Vladimir Putin can easily say, and certainly Sergei Lavrov can say, well, look, don't denounce what's happened in Crimea as brutal aggression. Look at Iraq, look at Libya, look at Afghanistan. I mean, the moral high ground has clearly been lost, I suppose, in Vladimir Putin's eyes, on the part of John Kerry.
Well, they've already said that, and indeed, when he was a senator, Kerry voted for the invasion of Iraq. Even those of us, despite the fact those of us here in the United States opposed, saying at the time there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So he has no credibility at all. But I did want to go back, though, to Mr. Halligan's point. I just talked about NATO. And as a matter of fact, Ukraine is, as we speak today, a member of Partnership for Peace, which is the antechamber for NATO. And the latest report I just saw at the wire services today is that the Ukrainian Rada has prepared legislation asking for accession to NATO. Now, I don't think that's going to happen for the same reason it didn't happen the last time when Bush tried it, because then, the NATO states would be obligated to go to war on behalf of Ukraine and under the current
And nobody wants that, right?
No, of course not. But we could see the Western Ukraine and Kiev becoming a de facto participant in NATO if, in fact, we see NATO troops enter into Ukraine, which, as we know now, there are NATO forces on maneuvers in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland. So, this could be the sub silentio agenda here. I think we need to pay attention to that. As for Mr. Crawford's aspersions on my interpretation of the Kosovo advisory opinion, well, I'm a professor of international law. I've argued in the World Court. I single-handedly won 2 World Court orders for Bosnia, overwhelmingly in their favor. The first time this ever happened in the history of the World Court, going back to 1921.
Okay, Francis.
And under that advisory opinion, the people in Crimea can vote validly to revert to Russia. But I am not suggesting that Russia agree to that, because I think we're all in agreement at this point that would only exacerbate the situation.
And what would exacerbate the situation, Charles Crawford, is this NATO presence. If they come into Crimea, nobody wants a war. I mean, what's going to happen there?
If who comes into Crimea?
Well, if as Francis makes the point that there is a vote on closer ties with NATO with Ukraine, they're never going to join NATO. They didn't in 2008, but that would change the standing of what's going on, though, won't it?
Well, fundamentally, look, in real life, in diplomacy, there are, roughly speaking, 3 broad possibilities. Either the extremes expand and squeeze the middle, or the middle expands and squeezes the extremes, or you get a messy sort of thing sloshing backwards and forwards and no one's quite sure what's going on. The risk in this situation is that the extremes will expand and squeeze out the normal people in the middle. You will end up, in a sort of absurd, it must be NATO or it must be Russia situation, whereas everyone seems to be agreeing that Ukraine doesn't want to have that choice. And if you want to partition the thing, that would be very destructive.
What about the agreement in 1994, Vera? There was an agreement that from all sides that Russia wouldn't do this. I mean, do you see that this is breaking that agreement?
It could be interpreted like that. I'm not a specialist in international law, and I'll leave it up to specialists to decide. But the argument was that it is protecting the Russian people in Crimea and Ukraine. And speaking to Russian people in Crimea, they truly were terrified during the protesting in Kiev and felt relieved and very happy when the Russian army arrived in Crimea. There were all these pictures of people giving them flowers. There were celebrations everywhere. It was really happy times for Russians. I'm not saying that it was happy times for Tatars. My Tatar friend was very, very upset, and she was crying to me on the phone about it. So I'm aware of that dimension as well. But I think there was something in that argument that Russians needed that salvation. I think their ethnicity was threatened.
And the Tatar question in Crimea, I mean, clearly, okay, let's say Russians feel under threat, but Tatars must be feeling very uneasy at the moment.
They're feeling very uneasy because in the history of their culture, of course, Stalin has deported them from Crimea before. So the arrival of Russians to Tatars who don't follow foreign affairs and geopolitics seems to be that now they're going to start putting them all in trains and sending them to Russia. So it's simple, more peasantry population were very frightened. The leader of the Tatarstan, of the Tatarstan Republic of Russia, has arrived yesterday in Crimea and had a talk with the leader of the Tatars in Crimea. I was trying very desperately to find the results of the meeting, but the hope was there for some communication between these two republics, and hopefully there will be support from Tatarstan to help Tatars in Crimea to feel secure.
On the financial question, Liam, you mentioned 15 billion needs to get its way to Ukraine pretty quick, or else we could face implosion. Who's going to give that money? The IMF are going to step in, I guess, the EU, but who do you think will ultimately cough up the cash in the next month or so?